Safran. I'll be your moderator. I'm an associate professor in history at Penn State. I have an announcement. We will only be having 2 presentations this morning rather than 3 because one of our panelists, Birgit Krawietz, wasn't able to make it. Birgit is a Privatdozent at the University of Tubingen. She's written several articles and books on subjects ranging from organ transplantation to euthanasia. And her paper is available on the CD that you all received with the conference papers. Her paper centers on the opinions of contemporary Saudi muftis, and in particular, she focuses on issues such as cousin marriage, genetic counseling, and abortion for genetic defects. So if you're interested, you can read the full text of the paper. So today we'll start with Samar Farage's paper. Samar is also at Penn State. She's a senior lecturer in sociology. Her academic interests include an examination of Galenic and Islamic medicine, social theory, political sociology, and comparative politics. Dr. Farage is currently working on a translation of al-Razi's Ethics of the Physician and is revising a manuscript on music and medicine in medieval Islam.
Good morning. I want to first start by thanking Jonathan Brokaw for all his efforts and all the people that have helped make this conference possible. Because this is really a unique opportunity for us here at Penn State and for all the people that have come from abroad to meet and have interesting debates. This is a historical topic, and many people would think, what does the pulse diagnosis have to do with the ethics of the physician? And what I would like to do today is I want to try to point out that debates about bioethics and Islam don't have to simply deal with religious sources, or they don't have to be based on religious sources, such as the Hadith, the Quran, or the Sharia, but also can be entered into from a philosophical tradition, which is extremely rich in medieval Islam. And this is the tradition that I call the Galenic-Islamic tradition. And this is what I want to try to talk about today. So the pulse studies will serve for me as a point of entrance into understanding what the relationship between physician and patient was during this medieval period. So today, and I would like to read, and so I would really bear with me because I tend to lose my voice. I have a bronchitis. So reading helps me stay calm and on a keynote. Today the pulse is a number buried on a chart, a heart rate that one measures with a monitor, or an electrical wave zigzagging on a page. For the Galenic-Islamic tradition of over 1400 years, the pulse was a fundamental diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic aid that revealed health, disease, and states in between. I will relate 3 stories to illuminate key aspects of the medical encounter in the Islamic and Galenic tradition. The first story is going to tell you how my eyes were opened as to the nature of the pulse. During a visit to India 3 years ago, a friend who was worried about my sleepless nights took me to her Unani physician. Unani physician is really the remnants of this Galenic-Islamic tradition in Pakistan and India today. Despite my protestations to a long-standing lunacy, she suggested that I talk with him. We entered a small dark room, lit only by a couple of naked light bulbs. We were welcomed by a profusion of unfamiliar smells from oily liquids and colorful powders on 3 shelves. On the left and behind a high wooden table sat a very short man dressed in Western clothes. This was the Unani physician, and he beckoned me to sit in front of him. He started by asking me a number of very general questions. He spoke softly, then he placed his right hand very gently on my left inner wrist. I could not, while he was taking my pulse, he was chatting with my friend, in a language that I could not understand. I, in general suspicious of physicians, became increasingly doubtful of his abilities. How could he listen to two people talk simultaneously and understand anything of what they said? Or how could he be feeling my pulse without wearing a watch or ever being quiet? After a few moments of this hand-holding, he said, "Much of your sleeplessness has to do with your past head injury." I was flabbergasted. How could he know from touching my wrist that I had a severe concussion some 20 years ago in a car accident? It became obvious to me that the pulse was not simply something to be counted and recorded on a chart, but that it told him of hidden events long buried in my history. It was the first insight into the pulse as a storyteller. So I began to inquire. What was the pulse in that tradition that lasted 1400 years in the West and still continues today in the East under the name of Unani medicine? Unani means Greek, Unani. Galen himself, the famous Greek doctor of the 2nd century, had written 18 books and 89 small treatises on the pulses. Books on the causes of the pulses, diagnosis from the pulse, prognosis from the pulse, differences between pulses. And every Islamic physician, such as Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, Al-Majusi, Al-Kindi, had written chapters and books on the pulse. Physiologically, I will not bore you with the details, but something important. The pulse was simultaneously the movement of the arteries and the heart. However, the arteries did not pump blood, but they carried blood and spirits. Elaborate instructions were given on how and where to best touch the pulse. Pulses had several characteristics according to the heat in the body, according to the size, frequency, magnitude, rhythm, and regularity of the beats. Each characteristic had several dimensions. For each beat, for example, there were 27 varieties to understand the richness of this tradition. The colorful names given to the pulse bespeak its qualitative nature. For example, there was a mouse tail pulse that pointed to putrefaction and strong heat in the body, an ant-like pulse that called for different forms of evacuations and bloodletting, a saw-edged pulse that revealed hot tumors such as pleurisy and pneumonia. There was a worming pulse, a double hammer pulse, a gazelle pulse, a trembling pulse, twisted pulse, and so on, just to name a few. The pulse was also heard. The pulse was musical in nature by virtue of its rhythmic quality, numerical proportions, and circular regularity. Therefore, when evaluating the patient, health and illness were diagnosed by the rhythms of the pulse in analogy with musical consonance and discordance. Musical harmonies of the octave, the quint, and the quart were expressed not only in the harmony of body and soul, but were also linked to the harmonies of the spheres. The harmonic consonances of the spheres resounded the harmonies inside of us. Hence, most great Islamic physicians were trained in music and astronomy. Such beliefs in the music of the pulse were so ingrained up into the Renaissance, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, that several physicians really dispensed altogether with words and expressed the pulse in musical scales. The second story is a story from a biographical fragment on the life of Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, as he was known in the West. And it shows the centrality of the pulse to medical knowledge and practice. Avicenna had just successfully treated the sovereign's wife. When Avicenna boasted that his fingers were so sensitive as to feel the rhythms of the pulse even through a string attached to the patient's wrist, the ruler decided to teach him a lesson. He said, quote, "An individual will be hidden behind a curtain with a string connected around their wrist. You may only touch the string, and if you're successful in your diagnosis, you will be rewarded richly. However, if you're wrong, you will be banished and all your possessions will be confiscated." End of quote. Avicenna agreed to the challenge. Behind the curtain, the string, however, was attached to the tibial pulse of a cow. Avicenna placed his fingers on the string, listened carefully, and then announced, "All this patient needs is grass." The good physician was distinguished from the charlatan by his knowledge of the pulse. To his discriminating touch, the pulse could reveal imbalances in both the body and the soul. Since touch was the only sense without an intermediary, it responded to the slightest changes in the pulse. For example, physical ailments, inflammations, fever, even the onset of death, no less than melancholia, hidden pregnancies, were all narrated by the pulse. The Galenic-Islamic encounter relied on 3 steps: direct sense perception, an extensive questioning of the patient, and deduction through keen reasoning. The physician had to first feel the patient. This is why, for instance, physicians sniffed the breath, feces, and urine of the patients. They tasted the 7 flavors of their sweat, and they examined their skin, nails, pupils, and tongue, among other things. The patient's room, habits, clothing, and even the relatives of the patient were subject to the physician's purposeful curiosity. This intense and intimate examination occurred over time, not only because the physician had to grasp the differences between health and illness for each patient, but also to determine the stage of the illness itself. Then the physician questioned the patient as to his ills and pains, way of life, and even dreams. The importance of the physician's word made clear that the relation of trust and confidence was necessary for a successful treatment. Finally, the physician reasoned from evidence through logical demonstrations and proofs to gain knowledge of the particular nature of the patient and his affliction. Now, to my third story. My third story illustrates why the pulse was called the voice of nature, how the soul and body were mutually dependent, and how virtue and health were inseparable in that tradition. The story goes as follows, and it's a very famous story. Even until today, people relate it. A relative of the sovereign of Jurjan was sick. He was complaining of an illness, which the efforts of all the physicians of the country could not relieve. Avicenna was invited for advice. After examining the patient, he requested the help of someone who knew the names of all the districts and streets of the province. He made him repeat the names while he himself had his finger on the pulse of the patient. Upon the pronunciation of the name of a certain town, Avicenna noticed a flutter in the pulsation. Now he said, I need a person acquainted with all the quarters, streets, and houses of the town. The same phenomenon was noticed upon the pronunciation of the name of a certain street, and again upon listing the names of the members of a certain family. Avicenna concluded, this boy, he said, is in love with the girl living in that particular house in the specified street of this particular town. The face of that girl is the remedy, which alone can cure the patient. The pulse, in the Islamic tradition, the pulse very often is referred to as a messenger. And this story made me understand that. And this messenger is a messenger between the mysterious world of the unknown and the known that revealed secrets and omens that could not be uttered. For example, Al-Majusi, one of the great physicians, said, the pulse is a messenger that does not lie, and the mute announcer that tells of secret things by its movements. Thus, it was crucial for diagnosis and prognosis both. The medieval Arab physician did not only cure the illnesses of the body, but also the diseases of the soul. Body and soul were dependent on each other. The mizaj, or the balance of the body, the humors, affected the soul. And as Galen, their great teacher, said, quote, the faculties of the soul depend on the mixtures of the body, and we derive good mixture from our food and drink and other daily activities, and this mixture is the basis on which we build the virtue of the soul, end of quote. The soul had corporeal localization. The rational soul resided in the brain, the natural soul in the liver, and the vital soul in the heart. By virtue of this localization, Imbalances of the body affected the soul and vice versa. Even today, the word mizaj refers to a state of the soul as well as to the constitution of a person. Hence the importance of spiritual medicine, at-tib al-ruhani. It's not the prophetic medicine, but it's at-tib al-ruhani. And spiritual cures in Islam, which are modeled after Galen's book, titled On the Passions and Errors of the Soul. And these books, in general, prescribe cures for the diseases of the soul, such as anger, conceit, envy, lust, lying, etc. Several works on spiritual medicine were included as compendia to bodily medicine, and they focused on temperance and moderation and the superiority of reason as a guide to the passions. Throughout this Galenic-Islamic tradition, philosophy and medicine were wedded. This is evident in the figure of the Hakim, who is both a philosopher and a physician. Little wonder that philosophers felt obliged to write on medicine, and physicians wrote on philosophy. Galen was very explicit on this point, and he gave his instructions in a small book titled Why the Best Physician is Also a Philosopher. In antiquity and throughout the Islamic tradition, both philosophy and medicine were, however, practical arts of living, which entailed detailed rules of conduct and action that aimed at a conversion and transformation of oneself through daily practice. Within such a perspective, both medicine and philosophy were oriented by the Socratic question, how do I live the good life? One lives the good life by striving towards wisdom through the cultivation of both health and virtue. A healthy and virtuous life was one lived in accordance with the mean, which was understood as what is fitting and appropriate for a particular person in a particular place. In bodily health, the mean was expressed through the appropriate blending of humors, the mizaj, and in ethics it was revealed in the moderation of the soul, i'tidal, as the mean between excess and deficiency. A search for wisdom demanded from the physician an ascesis, or practical exercises, in all parts of the philosophy. In logic, so as to speak and judge better, in ethics, so as to act appropriately, and in physics or natural philosophy, so as to understand one's place in the cosmos. In this tradition, the practice of medicine was embedded within a cosmological order and founded on nature. Nature was composed of a set of correspondences that connected the soil to the stars. For example, the elements, the humors of the body, the qualities, temperaments of the soul were aligned with the seasons, with the winds, and with the stars. Nature was drawn towards a harmony of the whole, which implied that nature was the first healer that did nothing in vain. It was for this reason that the Galenic physician was limited to only assisting nature in order to conform to it. But the physician could not assist nature without hearing its voice. That's why the pulse was called the voice of nature. Pulse taking was like the anamnesis of a patient, except it was nature here that narrated her history. The pulse revealed the bios of the patient, her habits of soul and body, and her stance in the world. The common experience of both patient and doctor of flowing humors, as expressed in the pulse, required the physician to empathize with the patient. In Islamic ethic, you will find very often references to rifq, rahma, and as well as in Greek ethics, the term philanthropia referred to this relationship of empathy and trust. As the physician had to reckon always with tragic events, with dramas, with struggles, the relationships with the physician and patient, between the physician and patient, was best described as mimetic and philanthropic. The medical encounter involved three sets of ethical duties: one for the patient, one for the physician, and one for the relationship between them. Both physician and patient had to follow elaborate regimens aimed at cultivating certain dispositions and habits of the body and the soul. The physician had to follow a set of duties that included being learned, studious, patient, well-mannered, properly attired, moderate in their behavior. The patient was required to be truthful and obedient. These virtues exhibited by both physician and patient hastened the healing powers of nature by forging a relationship of trust, confidence, and compassion. Interestingly, in Arabic, the root of the term akhlaq, as well as the term ethos in Greek, point not only to an innate disposition, but also to the cultivation of a second nature through habitual practices. We can see from all this that ethics, understood in the Islamic Galenic tradition, was relational, aiming at character formation and virtue. Ethics was practical and lived. It centered on personal action and conduct. However, all this changes in the 17th century, when Galenic medicine was eclipsed in the West and scientific medicine took its place. The history of scientific medicine and the birth of a new perception of the body can be read, again, through changes in the understanding of the pulse. First of all, the pulse became quantitative and mechanical. Instruments such as the stethoscope, the sphygmometer, reduced it to countable beats, heartbeats. The pulse also became senseless. Instruments did away with the sense of touch, and what was once felt was now visualized. The trusted words of the patient, as well as the pulse as storyteller, were now reduced to a babble of voices that had to be silenced. The objective physician of Laennec, the inventor of the stethoscope, was made deaf to the dramatic stories told by both patient and pulse, and therefore the physician could no longer really empathize with the sick person. The mimetic relation between patient and physician was transformed into a diagnostic one. Sensual perception that intimately linked doctor and patient formed the basis for an ethical encounter. Such an ethical encounter is made difficult when instruments are trusted more than people. The pulse also became soulless, as with Harvey's theories of blood circulation in the 16th century. With Harvey, the heart was thought of as a mechanical pump or a piece of machinery, and the arteries as a conduit for blood alone. Both heart and arteries were emptied of vital spirits. Descartes was instrumental in excluding the soul from the study of nature. And this exclusion of the soul from the study of nature meant that philosophy and medicine parted ways. Health and virtue no longer had anything to do with one another. The science of medicine became possible as human physiology could follow the laws of mechanics. The soulless mechanical pulse lost its connection to the world soul and world harmony. The link between the macrocosm and the microcosm was broken. With a nature shorn of all correspondences, medicine also lost its telos, its goal, and ethical foundation. Nature as dead matter, body as machine, and pulse as number all point to the twilight of the humors and the humoral body as the matrix for the union of the good and the true. The history of the body as an object of the scientific gaze becomes possible. Only the body that has a history uprooted from its cosmological underpinnings can be objectified, constructed, and deconstructed. This body emerges as a lifeless object to which the doctor could now do anything. It can be prodded and poked by instruments. It can be subjected to harmful experiments, regulated and monitored by life support systems. I'm arguing here that the silencing of the pulse reveals a turning point in the history of the medical encounter. The transformation of the pulse from the breath of life into a vital sign of a standardized universal body also indicates, in my opinion, a fundamental shift from the ethics of the physician to medical ethics and bioethics. The Galenic-Islamic doctor was morally bound by the limits of nature. He did not intervene when he knew he should not, but he alleviated suffering, assisted the patient in finding the right balance, and in withstanding the agony of illness, basically the human condition. He encouraged the patient to live virtuously and to endure that mortal condition. Today, in the age of life support machines, organ harvesting, genetic engineering, and lifestyle management, I believe it important to seriously consider whether the ethics of the physician, the Islamic physician, in the Middle Ages bears any kind of resemblance to what is called bioethics today. In contrast to the ethics of a physician, which was always concrete and relational, which was always directed at a particular person, professional ethics, whether of medicine or business, refers often to rules and regulations that aim to minimize the possible damages of techno-scientific interventions. If there is a distinction between ethical practice and juridical prescriptions dispensed by professionals, then it seems to me difficult to read bioethics back into the ethics of the physician. This distinction also suggests another one that indicates the historical peculiarity of bioethics today. Who is the subject of bioethics? Are they not simply objects which are constituted by technoscience, whether neomorphs or frozen embryos and so on? Can you imagine Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, or Galen ethically replanting a harvested organ or obtaining informed consent to sell parts of a cadaver? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Samar. I think we'll reserve questions until after Justin has delivered his paper. Our next speaker is Justin Stearns. His paper is entitled Enduring the Plague, Ethical Behavior in the Fatwas of an 8th or 14th Century Mufti and Theologian. Let me tell you a little bit about Justin. He's a visiting professor at Middlebury College in the Department of Religion and a doctoral candidate at Princeton University in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He has also been trained in Arabic at the Center for Arabic Language and Eastern Studies in Sana'a, Yemen, and the American University in Cairo. And his academic areas of interest are Islamic civilization, Arabic language, medieval Spain, and intellectual history of Contagion.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking, as have those who've gone before me, the organizers of this conference, especially Jonathan Brokup, but also Shireen Hamdi, who is unfortunately not here, who first drew my attention to the conference and who helped me take part. The material I'm presenting today is based on 2 chapters of my dissertation, which I will hopefully be finishing very soon, and essentially deals with the concept of contagion in Muslim and Christian thought in medieval Iberia, both before and after the Black Death of the 14th century. Now, in the second half of the 14th century, plague swept repeatedly through the Mediterranean, devastating both the Christian and the Muslim worlds. My interest here is to investigate the ways in which 2 renowned and respected scholars of Nasrid Granada address the ethical and social challenges posed by the plague, and how such a reading can offer us deeper insight into the nature of law, medicine, and theology in the post-formative period of Muslim thought. Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub played important roles in the political and intellectual life of Granada during the 14th century. And it's important here that we understand that both of these men were respected, prominent members of their society, and that they knew each other. Ibn al-Khatib was the most prominent historian of Al-Andalus of his time and was also an important vizier. In the wake of the Black Death, Ibn al-Khatib wrote a treatise entitled The Satisfaction of the Questioner Regarding the Appalling Illness. مقنية السائل عن المرض الهائل. This work deals chiefly with the medical aspects of the plague, but included in its strong defense of the need to flee the plague is an unabashed attack on those legal scholars who denied the principle of contagion. For Ibn al-Khatib, any prophetic traditions and prior legal arguments that denied contagion had to yield before the empirical evidence that supported the contagious nature of the plague. Ibn Lub, who was one of Ibn al-Khatib's teachers and the most prominent Granadan legal authority of his day, has received considerable less attention in modern scholarship than his student. In 2 of Ibn Lub's legal opinions or fatwas, he denies the phenomenon of contagion and argues for the importance of tending to the sick. While Ibn al-Khatib's views on the plague were, to my knowledge, universally ignored by subsequent generations, Ibn Lub's fatwas were favorably cited down into the 17th century. Now, both Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub formulated their views from within an ethical framework at a time when the social fabric of the Ummah, or the Muslim community, was coming under extraordinary pressure. And despite that fact, and the fact that they belonged to the same society, that they knew each other, that they interacted, that they sat and studied together, they came to diametrically opposite points of view. How and why did this happen? To fully understand Ibn al-Khatib's argument for the existence of contagion, it is necessary to briefly consider the legal debate that existed around the issue and into which he entered. In a series of traditions found in the 6 canonical collections of Hadith, the Prophet Muhammad offers seemingly contradictory opinions, I need to stress here, contradictory opinions on whether or not a disease can pass between healthy and sick animals and people. The Prophet, on the one hand, denies the existence of contagion, along with other pre-Islamic misconceptions. There's a whole series of various pre-Islamic beliefs which he denies. On the other hand, at the same time, he advises against mixing healthy animals with sick animals, and adds that one should flee from lepers as if they were lions. This set up a problem for early commentators on the Hadith. And this goes into all the early debates around the Hadith in the 9th century between Mu'tazilis and their opponents. This issue comes up repeatedly. And not just there, it continued on into the genre of commentaries on prophetic tradition, with the majority of authors arguing that contagion does not exist. In part, these scholars, the early commentators, were able to reconcile the problematic traditions by citing the legal principle of sad al-Ri'a or sad al-Ra'i, or forbidding a nominally permissible course of action because it would lead to a prohibited action. And the argument here that they took was that it was not because of contagion that the Prophet forbade approaching the plague or mixing healthy with sick animals, but because credulous and uneducated Muslims might be fooled by the apparent existence of contagion, to believe that diseases have the ability to transmit themselves. And thus, by positing the existence of a causative agent other than God, they would slip into believing in polytheism. So the argument of the defenders of prophetic tradition said the Prophet said these things not because he actually believed in contagion, but because he wanted to avoid the possibility that people might come to essentially commit the sin of idolatry. How does Ibn al-Khatib deal with this? Because he's arguing for contagion. He presents his reader with a dual-faceted legal argument in favor of the efficacy of contagion. The first aspect can be found in his selective citation of prophetic tradition. He chose to mention 2 traditions which, when combined, strongly suggested the validity of contagion. So he cites those parts of prophetic tradition which support his own view, and the acceptance of this view by the Prophet's companions. The second aspect of his compressed argument can be found in his blanket refutation of legal arguments and prophetic traditions that were detrimental for the Muslim community. And here he's invoking a second level of legal interpretation. By taking this step, he chooses to present his reader with a rationale which is implicitly based on the objectives of the law or maqasid al-sharia. And what's interesting for us here is that the canonical understanding of maqasid al-sharia is actually being formulated at the very same time by al-Shatibi, who's sitting next to Ibn al-Khatib and is also a student of Ibn Lub, and they're all sitting together in the same mosque in Granada. Generally defined as the preservation of religion, life, mind, honor, and property, the maqasid of the law provided jurists with a method to privilege general objectives over specific injunctions. That is a way for Ibn al-Khatib, in this sense, to get around specific prophetic hadith with which he doesn't agree. Basing himself on empirical evidence, Ibn al-Khatib can see no benefit to staying in a plague-struck area. Instead, he goes so far to equate a decision to do so with stretching one's hands towards destruction. He bitterly attacks those legal scholars who have advocated placing oneself in danger, noting that some of them have in fact recanted. For Ibn al-Khatib, the only proper response to the plague is to advise all Muslims to avoid persons who have been infected and to flee from an area in which the plague is found. So much for Ibn al-Khatib. What about his teacher, Ibn Lub? Unlike Ibn al-Khatib, Ibn Lub draws heavily on previous legal and religious works that have addressed the issue of contagion. I argue here that Ibn Lub, while choosing to support a majority legal opinion, that's the denial of contagion, did so with new arguments drawn from Asharism, thus giving his fatwas additional theoretical support. In doing so, Ibn Lub attacked Ibn al-Khatib's principal argument of empirical evidence with the doctrine of occasionalism. And this is important because the argument between the 2 scholars was fought out in the realm of empirical evidence. That's what they were talking about, is how to interpret empirical evidence. Occasionalism, the belief that God causes each and every action to occur and that 2 consecutive moments have no causal relation to each other, is a central tenet of Asharism, and so that serves in part to deny causal efficacy to anything but God. Now, implicit in this is that no thing possesses a nature or essence that is independent of God, and which could thus cause anything on its own. The problem with contagion, then, for people who follow Ash'ari theology, is that it implies that diseases have natures that will allow them to pass from one human or animal to another. Admittedly, this situation could have been resolved by introducing a concept of secondary causation in which God gives entities a limited ability of causation. Now, while this possibility is not explicitly ruled out by Ibn Lub, it's worth noting that Ash'ari theologians of that time period were calling people who believed in secondary causation heretics and essentially not acknowledging them as Muslims. Ibn Lub doesn't do that himself, but the examples he advances support a strict understanding of occasionalism. And it's important for Ibn Lub to reject secondary causation because it would not be ethical for him to do what he's going to do. That is to advocate, if he had accepted secondary causation, he would essentially be advocating that Muslims place themselves in danger by remaining close to a certain source of death. Instead, while Ibn Lub admits that sicknesses may pass between people, he strongly denies that this could happen through the nature of the illnesses themselves, or that the sicknesses can be considered to be causes. He carefully omits any mention of disease transmission in the case of plague, as opposed to, say, that of leprosy. For Ibn Lub, it follows that when a believer is confronted by the plague, he should not fear the possibility of infection, but should rather trust in God and consider his responsibilities as a Muslim. Ibn Lub is quite clear on the nature of these responsibilities. In a time of sickness, in a time of plague, as confirmed in prophetic tradition, it is the duty of Muslims to take care of the sick and to look after them. So we have two absolutely opposite reactions to this natural disaster. How has this been treated in the historiography of people talking about reactions to plague? It's not surprising that Ibn al-Khatib's strident defense of empiricism and his harsh words for narrow-minded jurists have been widely acclaimed in Western scholarship. They fit too well with the conventional view that Muslim jurists were and are obsessed with prophetic tradition and distanced from reality. Within this framework, Ibn al-Khatib is seen as a lone voice of reason in an age when few others had the courage to stand up to a religious establishment that, it is assumed, was oppressive and censorious. I would like to propose a slightly different interpretation. Both Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub strove to find an ethical answer to the challenge posed by epidemic disease. They differed on whether or not plague is contagious. Now, with some notable exceptions, plague is in fact not contagious. Contagion implies a disease that is able to transmit itself directly from one person or animal to another. In the case of plague, direct transmission occurs only in pneumonic and septicemic cases when the plague bacteria find their way into the lungs or bloodstream respectively. Once this happens, the bacteria could easily be passed to others through coughing or the exchange of blood. The vast majority of cases that Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub would have seen, however, would have been victims of bubonic plague, in which the bacteria infect the lymph nodes and produce painful, swollen buboes. In bubonic plague, the plague bacteria are not transmitted directly from one victim to another. Instead, the victims are infected independently by fleas. In the majority of the cases, the fleas are rat fleas, which have acquired the plague bacteria from their hosts. In some cases, plague bacteria can be transmitted by human fleas, but this is rare. The empirical evidence supporting the contagious nature of the plague was therefore far from clear in the 14th century, and the transmission of plague in general would remain a mystery into the late 19th century. In this framework, then, it is rather forced to see Ibn al-Khatib as the lone voice of reason and Ibn Lub as a blind slave to legal tradition. Both men were attempting to address an overwhelming situation with insufficient knowledge, and both came to the task with specific preconceptions. Whereas Ibn al-Khatib believed that empirical evidence supports the existence of contagion, if he had looked closer, he might have noticed the facts didn't fit his understanding as neatly as he would have liked. Ibn Lub, on the other hand, would not have found anything in the consequences of bubonic plague that would have shaken his belief in occasionalism. Sometimes proximity to a plague victim would result in the transmission of disease, sometimes not. The empirical evidence was not sufficiently compelling to force him to reevaluate his understanding of secondary causation. Now, to conclude, this brief discussion of Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub has dwelt at length on the differences between these two scholars, and has tried to explain how the arguments of both, while contradictory, could be considered valid. Yet it is perhaps their similarities that are more interesting. As already mentioned, both men strove to find an ethical solution to an impossible situation. Both scholars also held that law is based on overarching objectives, sometimes implicitly. They argue this. That is the maqasid al-sharia, and not on simple adherence to a legal tradition. The larger implication of this observation for Islamic law is perhaps unsurprising. As the facts available to jurists change, so will their views on specific subjects. The facts are, admittedly, often unclear or contested, as in this case, and social and political forces often impede or shape legal change. In the case of the plague, however, the legal position has changed along with the facts, and I add here kind of as a footnote what has happened to the doctrine of contagion in recent years. In a recent collection of essays on the interaction between medicine and faith, the former Grand Mufti of Tunis, Muhammad al-Mukhtar Salami, about whom we heard some opinions yesterday in Thomas Eich's presentation, addresses the issue of contagion in the light of current medical knowledge. After reviewing all prophetic traditions, he explains that a belief in contagion is permissible, as long as it is based on an understanding of contagion as a product of secondary causation, and not as a result of the disease's own nature. As mentioned above, such a position was clearly refuted by classical Ash'arism as heretical and would have been difficult to accept on theological grounds. In part, however, the Mufti is able to unite the conflicting views of Ibn al-Khatib and Ibn Lub, for while supporting the phenomenon of contagion, he is also stressing the importance of visiting and consoling the sick. And here his argument might not be entirely coherent, but he's trying to cover a lot of different bases at the same time. Yeah, so at the same time that he accepts contagion, he also stresses the importance of visiting the sick, and he emphasizes that there is an escape from contagion. It is, after all, God who controls all things, and it is in God that man should trust. While such an argument may not display a perfect outward consistency, it does indicate how for Muhammad al-Mukhtar, as for many other Muslim jurists in both the modern, pre-modern, and modern periods, the articulation of substantive law involves a careful balancing of both the community's spiritual and social needs. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have plenty of time for questions. Jonathan has the microphone.
This is for Dr. Farage. I enjoyed your presentation very much so, actually, because we're looking at history and the way you brought ethics into the picture. I have a few questions for you. The one thing, you related how ethics was related to philosophy in the classical period, and perhaps health and virtue also related, virtue ethics. I would like you to comment on the religious aspects of this. As you mentioned, Imam Al-Razi's Tibet al-Ruhani, he mentions in that book about trying to follow the prophets at some point. Al-Majusi, in his introduction to his work, mentions taqwa as a predominant necessary characteristic of a physician. And some of the works that you mentioned, Tibet al-Ruhani, in the chapters are very much so like the Matrat al-Qulub in the religious literature about the disease of the heart, where conceits and envy and jealousy, which are written about from the beginning of the Islamic scholarship in the religious tradition. So how that interplay was, something that I didn't get from your presentation, how that occurred. And also commenting on that, Al-Razi was viewed by some as heretical because he placed such a big, importance upon philosophy, perhaps even more than a revelation. While Al-Majusi was not the same way. He also spoke about virtue ethics and taqwa, but was seen as predominantly within the Islamic tradition.
Well, I don't like saying the Islamic tradition. You're talking about the religious traditions, basically. But this tradition is very much a parallel tradition that ends up leading to the same or similar conclusions, because we have to understand what philosophy was during that period. And many of the Islamic physicians, philosophers, hakims, said that philosophy is the imitation of God to the extent possible by humans. And this kind of definition of philosophy, I think, leads us really to say that you have two ways of reaching God and glorifying Him, through reason on the one hand, and through revelation on the other hand. But these roads ultimately are concerned with one thing, which is the glorification of God and His creations, which is nature. So I'm choosing to take the road of philosophy to see how at the end there is really no, I don't want to say there is no opposition between that and revelation, but it's a different road that ends up leading to the same thing. And I can read you, I'll just read you a statement of Al-Razi, which I'm familiar with, when he talked about reason. And this is what he said: by reason we have comprehended matters obscure and remote, things that were secret and hidden from us. By it we have achieved knowledge of the Almighty, our Creator, the most majestic of all that we have sought to reach. I think this gives us clarification into the role of reason. Most of the time we think of reason and revelation as opposed, and I don't think they were opposed in that tradition. Because at the end...
My only question is, were they also influenced by the religious writers at that time? So my question...
Of course they were influenced. I mean, the religious environment was everywhere around them. You're imbued in a tradition, correct? So I cannot say that these people, and whether Razi was a heretic or not is a subject of debate, and I don't want to enter into that because depending on who was speaking at that point. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Farage Muazzam. I really enjoyed both the papers. It's a treat for a physician to listen to material like this. Dr. Stearns, one of the things that you talked about, first a comment to you and then a couple of things to Dr. Farage. At this time, we still believe that science, we have come to believe that science is neutral. It's not. As physicians also, we start off with preconceived notions, and then we try and justify our belief, and that also includes things like diagnosis. So I found it very interesting. Here were these two people, and they were not coming from a vacuum. They believed in things, and that's why they were trying to kind of fit it in. But anyway, I enjoyed it. Dr. Farage, Ruhani al-Ilaj, I come from Pakistan. Ruhani Ilaj, as it's called, which is the spiritual medicine, is very much still present. It exists together with allopathic medicine in Pakistan. And I think there are several reasons for it. One, of course, is the belief, that there is something spiritual. But the other thing is that Ruhani Ilaj in this day and age is far more accessible to a larger number of people. It is less expensive than allopathic medicine. So the other thing also is that those who do Ruhani Ilaj in Pakistan are still, by the allopathic physicians, are considered to be charlatans. But they continue to provide something additional, which is they talk to people and they lay their hands on the individual. So in the place where I am right now, for example, kidney transplantation, the patient will not normally give this information, but if you ask them, they will get a kidney transplanted, and just as they give them immunosuppressive drugs, at the same time the patient very often is given this particular water over which some verses have been said. So it's really a fascinating thing that still exists, but some of that is the socioeconomic thing. Allopathic medicine is out of the reach for many people. The other thing that I found, I hope you don't mind if I can make one more point. Please. The other point about bioethics that you pointed out is interesting. From the language, we the English speaking people talk of ethics. One of the studies which we are trying to do right now in Pakistan is Pakistan ethics is translated as akhlaq, because Urdu is a combination of, as you know, Farsi and Arabic. And the issue is we have a certain picture when we say ethics. So the study that we're trying to do is to essentially speak to our patients and see what they understand by a physician who is ba-akhlaq or akhlaqi physician. And it's been fascinating when you do this in Urdu and you ask the patients, who should really be the people who are the focus of ethics. And one of the questions is an open-ended question. In Urdu it's ba-akhlaqi doctor ki sifat kya hai? What are the characteristics? And here is what it is. Invariably there are 4 or 5 things. He's compassionate, he spends time, he never gets angry, and he serves humanity. And this is consistent. And the amazing thing is that at the competence of the physician, which in ethics is extremely important, if it is mentioned all the way down. So the Pakistani patient, when he or she talks of akhlaq, has a very different concept from what we now have come to believe as the ethical doctor, in which it is the act. Did you take the informed consent ethically? And what does that mean? Did you give all the information? Did you talk about all the possible complications, et cetera, et cetera? Yes. But in the akhlaqi doctor, what the patient wants is you sat, you talked, you were compassionate, yes, and also that you were polite. Politeness comes up again. So it's a fascinating
continuation of the same tradition.
And yet these are not Muslim scholars. These are the average Muslim patient. So it's this amazing thread. Yes. But the sad part is that Muslim doctors are losing that because we're training in a very different way.
Yes, in scientific medicine.
Yeah, and as Fazlur Rahman said, we have a lot of doctors who are Muslims, but we have very few Muslim doctors left.
Yeah. I wanted to mention one thing. The other word that is used very often in the medieval period for the ethics of the physician is not only akhlaq but adab, yeah, which also refers to a sense of culture, to this cultivation of virtue in its essence. Yeah.
Thank you for the presentations. I have two questions, one for Justin and one for Dr. Farage. First one, there is the Hadith collections tradition of the Prophet Muhammad about that if you were in a place that there is a plague, don't go in. But if you are in, don't go out. So this synonyms to today's time, infection control. So I don't know how this can.
If you look at my, for what it's worth, there's references in the actual paper, but this goes back to a case, a hadith based on what happened when the second Caliph Omar was in Sar, and he heard that if he went into Syria, that the plague had broke out, and there was an argument, and he's standing there, and Larry Conrad has written a wonderful paper on this. And it turns in, it enters the debate. It doesn't end up proving anything. It doesn't end up proving that contagion exists, because then a large number of people come in and start arguing back and forth about what it actually means that the Prophet said this. It's explained away by those people who don't believe that contagion exists by the principle of Sadd al-Riya. That is to say, you're saying don't go into that area, because if you do go into that area and you just happened, God willed it, to come down with the plague, you might be confused as a human and believe that that has to do with the contagion of the plague, but that's not really what happened. God willed it. And so then you might be deluded so far they believe that the plague has causative power, and you might end up therefore committing the cardinal sin of idolatry and then not becoming a heretic. So for later, of course, the same hadith is interpreted very differently. As you say, now in the 18th and 19th centuries, Muslim doctors and administrators are able to explain that hadith was specifically referring to the concept of quarantine. But before then, it wasn't. What this is interesting to see is you can have the same hadith and people in different time periods, depending on how they're coming to it, with which preconceptions, can use it to justify diametrically opposed positions.
And for you, Dr. Farage, the other point is, he talked about Tubb al-Ruhani, which is an excellent point about discussion. There's a lot of talks about it in terms of the diseases of the heart. But my question about philosophy, reasoning, and science, not faith, let's talk about science. And do you see there's a contradiction between science and reasoning in terms of, if we go by reasoning, then we don't have to do experimental sciences because we could depend on reasoning and deduction and whatever to get conclusion. However, but in the real life, we have to go to the lab to ask questions, and sometimes the result does not go along with reasoning. I mean, that's contradiction between science and reason and philosophy. Do you see there is contradiction?
I think we have to be careful about, using the word science in the same fashion to refer to Al-Razi, Ibn Sina, and what we are doing today in the lab. Science had a completely different meaning at that point, in the sense that it was limited by nature. And we have to always remember that nature provided this moral limit to science, whereas today science is open to any kind of experiment and all that. And I think also in Al-Razi's The Ethics of the Physician, he makes very clear, you do not experiment on any subject. That's why, I wanted to correct something that Dr. Bella was saying yesterday. You used the word tajriba, and you translated it as experiment. I think it was experience, not experiment. That would be more correct, if I may say it so. Because when Al-Razi uses tajriba, he uses it as experience, but he also avoids experimenting on subjects. We have to, you understand the difference between experience and experiment, which is very different. So, but your question says that today, you see, when I say science before was really bounded by reason and nature, whereas today it's out of the bounds of reason and nature. And I think that's what you're talking about. So if we make the differentiation between what science was then and what science is today, I think we get a clear understanding how reason fitted into the scientific tradition before. Yes.
My name is Khabiba Badaroun, and I'm a non-specialist, and I find both the conference as a whole and certainly your presentations most fascinating. Thank you. I think a little bit Professor Muazzam has introduced this question. I have a comment and then a question. Again, in response to Professor Muazzam, I wanted to say that as we ponder what has been lost through the suppression of certain traditions, for instance, from the Galenic-Islamic tradition of medicine, I think there are also other consequences that come from looking at socioeconomic conditions that are different between the West and places in Africa and in Asia. For instance, it is much easier for multinational pharmaceutical companies to arrange medicine trials in countries where such traditions are less policed and regulated. So I think there is that other, perhaps less perceived consequence of looking at what has been suppressed. And my question to you, Dr. Farage, is of the legacies in Eastern countries that remain of the Galenic tradition, do they remain as legacies only in alternative medicine? Or, for instance, is there a way in which this is also present in the way the doctors are being trained in Eastern countries?
No, they still remain as alternative. As Dr. Muazzam said, because it is not, allopathic medicine is the preferred way of treatment, because it's believed to be, more beneficial in different ways. Whether it is or not, that's another question.
Thank you, Shabir Alibi from Toronto. I have a comment and then a question to Justin Stearns. My comments to what Dr. Muazzam was saying, and one of the problems is the semantics of language, because I think akhlaq in the Urdu terminology would be a poor equivalent for ethics, because they're not exactly the same. And in modern sort of Western secular discourse, the concept of professionalism is one that is very much in parallel with bioethical discourse and the notion of what makes a professional physician in terms of caring and compassion and honesty and all of those virtuous aspects. It's not something that has necessarily been lost. It may not be the focus of discussions like this, but that's because bioethics and professionalism have developed in parallel and have become somewhat separate streams. Maybe they shouldn't. But the problem is that akhlaq is somewhat closer to professionalism than it is to ethics. And although we, I think, see the concepts as intimately related, somewhere somebody has categorized and sliced and diced them. And I wonder if that's part of the problem. My question to Justin Stearns, and I thank you for the erudite discussion, is individuals like Ibn Khatib talk about the duty of not the average person to provide care for the sick, but the special responsibilities of physicians or other healers in a situation where there may be contagion, and how does one balance the risk of exposure to a healthcare provider, and is that risk any different from the risks that the average person ought to take to look after family members or those who are sick? I hope my question's clear.
It's a really good question, and I wish I could answer it. First of all, Ibn al-Khatib argued that you shouldn't expose, you should run away. Ibn Lub, his opponent, the Mufti, he argued that you should stay, but he was arguing in a very general sense about what the duty of a Muslim was, and he did not distinguish between a practitioner and a non-practitioner as far as medicine went. In the in the 14th century, trying to track and understand what the social response was to a natural epidemic of this kind, we seize the sources we have, and then probably without wanting to overinterpret their importance, simply because they're what we have. Where I find it, we're very lucky to find the material that Ibn Lub gave us in the form of a fatwa. That is to say that these were compiled, were thought to be of sufficient importance to be collected and published in a fatwa collection in the beginning of the 16th century by Al-Wanjarisi. And then Ibn Lub's words and his specific understanding of the situation, about the duty and necessity of Muslims to stay and take care of the sick, is continually cited in other plague treatises that were, because the plague continues to break out onto North Africa up until the 17th century. And in doing so, he and in general the jurists who write these treatises do not differentiate between the duties of doctors and your average Muslim, so to speak.
But then similarly, people like Ibn Khatib who write that the average person should stay away because of contagion, do people like Ibn Khatib differentiate between the average person's responsibility to stay away and the responsibility of healers to go in to such regions?
No, he doesn't. He sees it. I think it's hard for us today to imagine, even though that I think Hollywood is doing its best in recent years to give us these absolute disaster films of what it was like, but hard for us to imagine what the situation of a Muslim scholar in the 14th century would have been when faced with such an overwhelming social disaster as the Black Death, when newest estimates estimate 50% fatality rate, just huge numbers of people dying. And for Ibn Khatib's point of view, it was absolute lunacy to stay anywhere near it, anywhere near where there had been an outbreak, and so he advises flight for everybody concerned. Later on, people who take up Ibn Lub's stance, especially plague treatises written up until the 18th and 19th century by members of Sufi orders who identify themselves specifically as members of Sufi orders, will talk about the importance of tawakkul, will talk about the importance of going in and providing this service to other people. But even then, it's interesting, they don't differentiate between Muslims and doctors, or Muslim doctors and Muslims who aren't doctors. They see it more as a spiritual role, the necessity of tending to the sick, rather than the necessity of actually curing people, which, although some people said they were able to do it, didn't really seem to be happening very much during the Black Death.
Hello, I really enjoyed your talks. Thank you very much. I wanted to make a couple of comments to Dr. Farage as a cardiologist. I'm a cardiologist. I found your discussion fascinating because although many of Galen's terms and phraseology are very metaphorical and they're very amusing and very sort of quaint, they're actually very clinically apparent. And just listening to his descriptions, you can name at least 4 or 5 of those that are actual disease entities. And the other comment, just to say, is that in clinical practice, from a practical point of view, the pulse is sometimes one of the most useful things. I think, although I agree with you that there's a definite differentiation between, Renaissance and pre-Renaissance medicine in terms of how the patient's viewed. What the pulse does, and I find this clinically, and especially in the community, we're from Elmhurst in Queens, where many of our patients, especially many of our Muslim patients, I can't speak to in their primary language. The pulse really opens up an arena of trust and of dialogue, even though there may not be any verbal dialogue. But on the other hand, the comment you made about there being a difference in terms of an approach, a sort of humoral versus a more empirical approach, I think that Galen was probably the ultimate empiricist in the sense that he used the information that was available to him when he felt a pulse. The pulse opened up an arena. What really is very limiting about modern medicine is what we choose to consider the arena of empirical data. And that's where the philosophy comes in. Because if you open yourself up to a time when you're feeling the patient's pulse to observe, you know, if they have any residual, for instance, of a concussion, or if their family's there, or if they're, you know, eating anything at the bedside, or if they have a cross or something else at the bedside, you open yourself up to a much deeper understanding of your relationship with the patient and of what their sickness or problem might be. So I think a lot of it is empirical in terms of in terms of the understanding, whether it's Galenic or whether it's modern, just that we don't open ourselves up to that part of the care.
Yes, I mean, they always mention the mixture of experience and reason in any kind of diagnosis or prognosis. It's not that, and experience, if we want to talk about experience being the same as experiment, then that's the difference that I want to try to push. Yeah.
I liked your papers, both of your papers very much, especially Samar's paper, because it shows the contrast between the classical, so-called classical period and the so-called modern period. We can see that in the modern period there are different fields in society, like ethics, religion, philosophy, economy. What I said yesterday, these are different fields with different frames and languages that do not intersect wholly. And this was in the classical period somewhat different. And ethics was inherent in medical treatment. And nowadays, medicine has an ethical problem. And I think the main point is the patient-physician relation. What has happened to this relation from the classical to the modern period? I think it was not wholly equal, this relation between patient and physician formerly, but nowadays it has become a power relation, and the patient has become an object. In the hospital they say, oh yeah, cancer on room number 220 feels better today. And this kind of objectivation is deepened by technology. And therefore, at this point, bioethics emerges as a challenge to medicine. We talk about ethical questions because medicine has a problem here, and it's not a challenge to Islam or whatever. In the first case, I think it's a challenge for medicine. And to Justin's paper, I want to comment also contrasting your paper to the present. Although I know you don't like you don't like the comparison so much. But what struck me was that the two opinions that were formally opposed can be merged later. And I think the context, if Muslim jurists deal with a problem, the context in which they deal this problem plays a paramount role. And the quarrel of the two opinions that were opposed was about occasionalism and casuality. And they could not solve this problem in a coherent way, as you said. But even scientific reason cannot solve this problem in a coherent way. So scientific reason would say, okay, occasionalism and casuality occur in the same moment here. And so I think what we all try to do here is to look for a security in an insecure situation. We want to have secure answers in a situation that we cannot handle. the plague is an unsecure, very unsecure situation. So thanks.
I'm afraid we have run out of time for questions and comments, but we can certainly continue the discussion in the room next door over coffee and tea.